astrological events. So really, just immensely sophisticated again, to the point where we can't explain how they were able to observe these things that they were seeing in the sky without the kind of telescopes that we now have access to. Metallurgy, architecture, and engineering, also areas of sophistication. There were tools throughout the continent of Africa, including even steam engines. Metal tools, copper and iron as well, bronze, and even carbon steel. In ancient Tanzania, furnaces were made that reached over 1800 degrees Celsius, which is 700 degrees warmer than Roman furnaces that would have been otherwise similar. So again, things we typically attribute to Greeks and Romans were seen before that, and sometimes in more sophisticated ways. Architecture and engineering, clearly the Egyptians were highly sophisticated in that. Again, the pyramid and raising of many of the large obelisk towers is still where current day scientists cannot figure out how it was done, even with large amounts of labor force in the form of slave labor or whatever it may be. It's still hard to discover the physics of how these massive structures were compiled. Even using our technology of cranes that we would have, motorized cranes, is still difficult for us to construct what they constructed thousands of years ago. But again, Egypt is not the only place that we've seen that. So Zimbabwe and Mozambique, both those areas present day, have large urban cities, including a lot of stone structures. For instance, there was a 250-foot long curved granite wall. And that, if you can imagine, granite being extremely heavy, it is really hard to put into place. In West Africa, and we see empires of Mali, and in particular Timbuktu region, were just phenomenal cities. When Europeans arrived and witnessed what was there, just grandiose palaces, mosques, huge universities. I mean, these were true intellectual and cultural centers that were admired by Europeans prior to the colonization of Africa. Medicine is another field that there were many advances throughout ancient and historical Africa. Plants with salicylic acid, which is aspirin, were used to treat pain. Kaolin for treating diarrhea, and we see that in kaolin in modern times. There were antibiotic extracts used, plants to treat cancer, plants to cause abortions, and treat malaria. So a lot of the same things that we grapple with today, as well as a number of compounds that were discovered in Africa in ancient and historical times that we still use scientifically or research. I have a few of those examples there. And then there's a number of medical procedures that we saw in Africa before Europe. And here, again, is another example, in particular with vaccination. If you pick up a biology textbook, it's going to tell you that Europeans invented the vaccine. And however, we saw this in ancient Egypt tens of thousands of years prior. So vaccination, the process of autopsy, limb traction, setting up a broken bone, removing bullets, even brain surgery, skin grafting, filling of dental cavities, installing false teeth, and many of these procedures were done in an understanding that they needed to be aseptic or they needed to be sterile. Again, that concept did not appear in Europe until far later, and we attribute that to European in the late 1000s. So again, earlier and prior. Navigation, that's the last example I'm going to talk about. Again, impressive. So of course we all think about Columbus discovered America. That's what we're taught. I believe we're still taught that. And of course this is incorrect because there were already people there who clearly discovered it prior. But in addition, I guess the point here is that before Europeans sailed to the New World, to North and South America, Africans did. And I mentioned in the beginning, Van Serkino's book, They Came Before Columbus. So if you're interested, I highly recommend reading that book, because that book lays out all of the scientific evidence that reveals the fact that we have people from Mali and Songhai sailing to South America across currents that you can look up currents in the Atlantic Ocean, and you can see that there are some natural currents that go to the South American coast from West Africa. And so using that as guidance and aid in 100-foot long boats that could carry up to 8 tons, which is very impressive. In addition, these sailors also made their way to Asia and even took elephants on the boats over to Asia. So again, sophisticated navigation and travel where we rarely even hear about the African presence in South America or Asia prior to slavery or other things like that. So these are just a few examples of the vast array of what we know has happened historically in science, engineering, and technology in Africa. And I just hope that more people can learn about and appreciate this, so that we can change the narrative that science has been born by the white European man, and that's the origin of this massive knowledge. And in fact, it is before that and from a much broader group of people. So those are all my remarks. So I can turn my screen off for, let's see, you all let me know.
Dr. Blatch, I know you can't really hear us, maybe?
I can hear you now.
You can? Oh, great. Well, so if there are any, we can take a moment for questions, and then you can stay on if you like, or and for Kole's talk. So are there any questions for Dr. Blatch at this time? Okay.
Okay.
So we'll,
thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me get your screen up. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. Dr. Kole, we'll stop there. Okay, is a Yoruba language teacher at the University of Florida. He is a poet. I have read his poetry, and it is fabulous, who combines theory and practice of photojournalism and environmental activism. It may surprise you that Kole trained first as a botanist, and much later received the British Council Chevening Scholarship to study for a master's degree in TV video for development from the University of Reading, United Kingdom. His story changed on relocating to the US. He earned another master's degree in organizational communication at Ithaca College in New York, and still not satisfied, he went further to obtain a PhD in media studies from Rutgers. So Kole has lived in Gainesville since 2006, where he teaches Africa through films, and a course next spring on Yoruba culture and customs.
Thank you very much. Well, I must say a very big thank you to the Science Library, to Valerie and to Dan for putting this together. This is a conversation, and that's why from the beginning you heard what Africa has contributed. Now my job in this conversation is, let's understand the whole idea of science. What is science? And what are we really talking about? Does Africa have its own science? If I say that, with all of those things you've seen, you probably will say yes, and we'll wrap this up and we'll go. But I think that an understanding of what we mean by science is very, very important. We have to remember, says Joy Hendry, that some of the things we call science came from the Middle East, from Babylon and ancient Egypt. Others from India, and yet others from ancient China. So it's a conversation, like I said. Just to be sure that this question is not peculiar to African continent, I want to quickly point attention to Nakayama in his article in 1995, History of East Asian Science, Needs and Opportunities. He states, and I quote, "In the study of East Asian science, the formidable requirement for research in primary sources sharply divides those proficient in Asian languages for those who are not. This counts for more than boundaries of nationality." So, asking this question of a continent of Africa as a language teacher is not totally out of place. The observations I intend to share are buried in language-coded cultural practices. So, let's go ahead and do a little bit of definitions. On the one hand, African in the title is used symbolically. Everybody here, I don't need to go on and say that you all know that Africa is not a country, it's a continent of many countries and it's very diverse. So it's not possible for me to be speaking and asking whether the continent has. But I use it symbolically to say, those of us that come from that part of the world, even to the smallest ethnic group, the one I represent called Yoruba, do we have our own science? We will get into the question of what do we mean by science. Science, on the other hand, according to the Webster Dictionary, is defined as a branch of knowledge. If it's a branch of knowledge, then there must be a tree of which you get that branch. It is also accepted as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study. I highlighted that just because I'm going to pull out some of those operative words of the structure and behavior of a physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So, what are the operative words here? Systematic study of the structure and behavior of a physical and natural world through observation and experiment. The operative words are systematic study. Structure of the world that can be seen, that is the physical world, and the world as it is, that is the natural, not the man-made world. Because when we start getting into Africa, there is that question of the merger of the religious and the secular. And the fact that in all of the stuff you've heard and you've seen, hardly would anybody bring out the spiritual dimension, of which a lot of it, of when I was growing up, some of you, when you were born, they took the amniotic fluid from your mother to type out the kind of things that you are allergic to. In my case, when I was born, it was a spiritual experiment or a spiritual test. My left leg was placed on the divination board, and from the divination board, the diviner read off what had come into the world to be. And then they listed a number of things I should not eat. But as you would get on to here, as a post-colonial victim, I thought that was nonsense. I thought my parents didn't know what they were saying. And of course, I went off and ate all of those things. Were there repercussions? I'll keep that a secret until the end of this, if anybody remembers to ask me. So, African, there are times when people mix it African science and Africa's science. This is a deliberate choice of words. African science, in the minds of the Westerner, you're talking about voodoo. You're talking about magic and not logic. And for science, the good thing about science is that it is true whether or not you believe it. No? And then there's a method. I'll come back to this scientific method to see whether some of the things that are done on the continent also can be called science, or whether we need another kind of narrative to talk about us. But there's a guy called Sam Badger, and his definition is in Brian Moffin's work. Brian Badger, if you read it, you almost get a little confused. Is he using the same language, the Western language, or is he creating something new? Let's just see. He defines African science as a systematic, we've met that before, Complex we have not. An exclusive traditional process commonly noticed in a number of African cultures. A number of African cultures. And what is the exclusivity there? On the continent, it is not, we don't want to know everything. And it is not every knowledge that is available to everybody. There are some families that are devoted to some of these things. It is not everybody that is a diviner. It is not everybody that can walk into the medical school like you do and become a doctor. And there are reasons for it. Because with it comes responsibility. And you have seen the consequences too of allowing some people get into medicine without checking out their background, and you've seen what they have done with it. And that's why you have to create that thing called negligence. And a lot of people have paid for that. There are differences, and we will probably get into that, in which an attempt is made to describe, understand, predict, and control nature. Is there such a thing as African science? To answer that, I would like to begin by attesting to the fact that unequivocally, there is a science in Africa. You see how it changes? There is a science in Africa. Activities and nature which call for understanding and explanations occur in Africa, just as in other parts of the world. We also have traditional thinkers in Africa who also, through their years of training, attempt to unfold the truth in nature. So earlier cultures, such as Egyptians, just like you saw at the beginning, and the Mesopotamians, systematically observed the sky and developed systems of calculation and even astronomical predictions. All right? There is also this belief that this university you are in is because the initial university in Africa was studying the universe. And that was their primary concern. And that's how we came to be called university. Not that I really don't subscribe to that. I will, in fact, take on the Kenyan who said what we should have actually are multiversities as opposed to the universe and the university that we have. There's something about those of us who either work here or school here. We hardly have had the presence of mind to interrogate, what is this thing called? Why is it called university? I'm not sure there's anybody here who has taken time out to actually think of the etiology, the root meaning of the word itself, so that you understand why and what you're doing here, apart from the fact that you're here to study, be tested, and have a graduation in which you wear a very funny kind of garb that nobody else wears. And please keep that in mind, because there's a reason why I mentioned it. So the operative words, if these terms or words are understood in context, would have a better understanding of the similarities and differences in what I term Africa's science. So there's systematic, there's complex, and exclusive traditional processes. In the presentation before mine, you would have heard her talk about the complexity of the numerical system. Those who have come into the Yoruba class and studied the language would tell you the complexity. When we say 15, you just have a word, you say 15. We actually say 5 less 20. And when we want to say 123, we say 3 more than 20 in 3 places. My grandfather never had a calculator, he never had a biro, he never had a pen. He didn't write anything, but tell the number, he will tell you immediately. And I tell students, they say, why can't you make it easy? I said, the very day I remove this, I just fall into the hands of the anthropologists who say that the African mind is simple and it's simplistic. And the complexity of a mind of the Africans that God enslaved is something that Europe and America has not been able to come into terms with. So some of these things are there so that you begin to understand where we're going. We haven't reached there yet. And so there are activities that happen with this. It is to describe and to understand. That word in itself, to understand, needs to be unpacked. Predict and control nature. According to Felvio Mazzotti, cultures from all over the world have developed different views of nature throughout human history. And I will tell students who come to my Yoruba class that I still cannot understand the philosophy or the idea behind calling a house White House. Did the white exist before the house? Or you painted it white and then you moved the house in? Or, in the case of the Yorubas, they put the substance, its head initial, house, white, which I think happens in Spanish as well, or some other language. But in English, it seems to turn things over, you know. You say, my father's house. But what we're looking is a house. Your father is not there and does not need to be there. So these are worldviews, how our language also shape the way we see the world, relate to it, and how we even observe nature. What I'm sure you all expect from me today is to lay out the views of nature that different cultures in Africa developed. That I would not be able to do in the time allotted to me. But let's look at the mode of transmission. La Serrano in 2003 is credited as submitting that many of them are rooted, that is, many of Africa's cultural belief and systems and traditional systems of belief, which indigenous people use to understand and interpret their biophysical environment. Western science is based on academic and literate transmission, while traditional knowledge is often passed on orally from one generation to the next by the elders. We share this with the First Nation. We share this with the Native Americans. The way we have developed, the way of our inquiry follow almost the same pattern. The way some of the cultures that I know of and I'm aware of, how they transmit. And in the mode of transmission is also the problematic. It's also the contradiction. It's also the difficulty in understanding whether there is science at all, or whether science is science everywhere, whether this whole thing is globalized, and there's no need to look at it geographically. So the scientific method, going back, the method of it, how things are done, involves developing and testing theories about the world based on empirical evidence. This has not always been the case. Anybody who studied the history of science will know the movement from when everything was a result of the gods. If you had cold, it was the gods. If your food got spoiled, it was the gods. Nobody understood, to the point that even when people looked up on the mountain, they were not sure exactly what was happening there, because there were times when it was smoke and they felt the mountains were angry. Nobody understood how it was working. And then came the positivists, those who believe that everything about life can be seen by sheer numbers. You can break it down, first study the units, and then begin to see whether you study the whole. So it is always by empirical evidence. Anything that is not, that cannot be studied, observed, and measured would be snuffed at. It will be called all other names but science. It is defined by its commitment to systematic observation of the empirical world and strives to be objective. Now, there are two sides of that. The object, the instrumentation, to measure, instead of how many people are here? Well, there are 20. By my own subjective, just looking around, maybe there are more. But if you count and use the instrumentality of numbers, you will get the exact number. But that is again the fact that you think that all those who are here are those who are physically here. What of those who are watching us? What of the spirits? That you don't say here in an American. What are the spirits doing here? Why do they want to come and listen to this? So we can't count them because we can't see them. And that should not factor into our reasoning. And it doesn't make for reality to say that Kole's ancestors also attended this. How do I explain that to an American audience? That my ancestors are actually here. And they actually you know, I don't know why anybody is sitting on the 4 chairs, but all the 4 of them are gone. My maternal grandfather, grandmother. Maybe you reserve that for them. I don't know. And you don't know either. But something just happened. None of you are sitting there. And we all should assume that nobody is sitting there. That doesn't look academic. How do I use that as an academic discussion within here to say that it is not just the physical and the gross material that forms knowledge? Okay, so critical, skeptical, and logical. These are the things in which you throw in that I probably would also have my own perspective. It involves a series of prescribed steps that have been established over centuries of scholarship in the West. So this is what a scientific method will look like. You know, there is scientific inquiry, but the German who brought this, he divided it into 2. Now, there is I won't even try to pronounce the names, though I studied German, but I don't think it's good enough to pronounce anything this afternoon. You know, explanation, interpretation, definition, and so on and so forth. Concerns understanding of everyday life from one's empathic interpretation. Then there's the other natural science, you know, science, knowledge, and intelligence. These, if you divide them, scientific inquiry will go along this line. And then the steps, you saw it at the other time. Most times when you read theses from students, you would see methodology. What they mean is actually method. Methodology includes the following concepts as they relate to a particular discipline or a field of inquiry: a collection of theories, concepts of ideas, comparative study of different approaches, and critique of the individual methods. Now, how do all of this fit into? Because we're talking about the science of knowledge. How do we get to know what we know? How does the various groups on the African continent, how do we agree that what they know is also of substance? Because they do not go through the steps of ask a question, research existing sources, formulate a hypothesis, design and conduct a study, draw conclusions, and report your results. How all of those things you heard at the beginning of this, did they follow these steps? How were they created? So what is research? Research is merely a frame of mind. Once we have satisfied ourselves that the collection of information is systematic, you see, you got to satisfy yourself. Because there gets to a point in which there's a law of diminishing return when you're doing this research. All of a sudden, the results begin to be the same. And then you just satisfy yourself that, well, I have done it systematically. What is the binary opposition of systematic? Haphazard. You're just doing things. There's no rhyme and reason to what you're doing. And the question of intuition is not even allowed. But most of the time, scientists will tell you that there's a lot of intuition that comes into what they're doing. How much should I put into this? Should I try this? Sometimes it's thinking out of the box, and it will lead you to some places. Okay, so what is truth? And how do we as humans decide what is truth? That becomes a very philosophical question. If I say that I can feel the presence of my maternal and my paternal grandparents here, none of you can feel it with me. You don't even have the antenna to receive what I'm saying. It's like this is just some Harry Potter hocus pocus thing. But can it be scientific? Can it be real? Can it be real to me? And can I factor it into the way in which I do my work or pass it across? Traditional knowledge system. It exists, and there are people in the First Nation in Canada have been writing. They've been finding ways in which they can also make the methods of doing things, of inquiry, make it as valid as any other one, of which I think there are lots of people on the continent too that are doing that, but we also need to play them up. So reflections on research methodologies. Linda, in her book, defines methodology as the theory of method, or the approach or technique being taken, or the reasoning for selecting a set of methods. And that's what happens in the Western world. You choose the method you want, and then you carry out the experiment, but you have to give us a reason why you have chosen what you have chosen. She reminds us that the institution of research, its claims, its values and practices, and its relationships to power. We are talking about power here. And that's why there is a point in which you would see that science was exported, but somehow the Western world have also held the reins. If you do not write it in English and write it in a particular way, the gatekeepers will not even publish it. Most of the journals of repute are either in Europe or in America, which means that whatever comes from any part of the world has to go through the lens of these institutions. It's a power game, and it's been used very well. What if Africa's science is, as Bob Dick would say, defines a research consisting of a family of methodologies which pursue outcomes of both action and research understanding. It uses a process which alternates between action and critical reflection. This is what they call the participatory action research methodology, which is not used mostly in America and in Europe. It's almost an oppositional way of research because it takes time, and most of the times you are time bound. After a particular time, they want you to finish your PhD and get out because somebody else needs to come in. So you can't, many times, you don't even go back to the people where you collected your data to share with them. Because who has time for all of that? You don't even get credit for that anyway. So you do the things that you get credit for and move and contribute to knowledge, and somebody else will take it from there and go. And is that fair scientific method? Is that the way we should go? Are there others who do it differently? Are they in the periphery or in the center? What is the relationship between the center and the periphery? So this process of action and reflection, sometimes there are cultures on the continent that the two almost overlap. You wouldn't see the measurements and all of that. All you see is a product. There are, and I say in agriculture, the blacksmith who makes the hoe is also a farmer. And then he makes hoes of different lengths and gives to people, other farmers. And between them, they decide which one is more efficient and effective. And in Odeomu, a little place, a settlement in Nigeria, when other farmers look at a mold that has been done, the molds on the farmland, they can tell you which ethnic group made it, because they are the ones who make it like that. And they can tell from the kind of hoe they used. Now, how do we fit all this question of test, experiment, and all of that when the researcher is also researching and using the results to modify the instrument? There are times, and in herbal medicine, I brought with me what looks like, I brought this with me. This is Fagara xanthoides. It's a chewing stick that has been found to help manage sickle cell anemia. You use it to clean your teeth, and you swallow the water in it. But if you look now online, you would see that a lot of centers, even in Nigeria, have done research on this. And they can tell you how it works. Initially, people just, if you have your child having symptoms like this, it's never this big. There are smaller ones in which you chew, and then you swallow the saliva. But there's been some explanation right now. So, because I teach Yoruba language, and my interest in all of this is also, there are some things I know in Yoruba that I can't their translations will be lost in translation. But I wish to share them with you. And then you will see whether it fits in to the question of the experimentation you do and how you do it. And how, if this were in America, it will first go through FDA, it will first go through that human subjects, before you allow anybody to test it and show it and say, all ours is, we have an end in sight. We just want people to be well. Now, would that be abuse of the persons? And how do we ensure that people are not abused? The fact that, you see, this is from a natural product. I have done nothing to it. I'm not extracting anything. I'm not trying to synthesize it. This is the way the plant itself, if it lives and it has creative or efficacious parts of it, and the plant did not die, then there's a likelihood that this would not kill people. But there are, again, it's about a worldview. It's about things that have happened in Western science that has now made it very difficult for drugs. It takes very long from testing to the market. It takes like maybe 3-4 years or 5 before FDA would allow it. But let me reveal to you the 3 pathways. There's something called attenugen. These are ways in which you can contact diseases, things you eat with your mouth. And there's also the treatment. You can be given herbal preparations to drink. Then there's ataragba, the one in which you contact with your skin. And then there's finally atemole, the one in which you step upon. All of these are entry points, and all of these are also points in which you can be healed. As a young man doing advanced level biology, I had malaria, and my grandmother prepared a portion of herbs and said, Kole, drink this, and then before you drink, go into the bath with this hot one and take your bath. Take a wash. And I said, Grandma, that doesn't make sense. No, this thing, and I told her about the insect, the plasmodium, how it went into my stuff, and how the only thing that can do it is when I ingest something, it will go through my digestive system. You know, all of those things I was brainwashed to believe. And she said, would you just go and do what I asked you to do? And grudgingly said, what a waste. And I went and I did it and I took a shower. Years after, it occurred to me that what she was doing was that the entry point through my skin of a mosquito bite and the hot water was to expand it a little, and then some of the herb will go right into that place and start its work. But for me, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. But now, looking back, I'm beginning to see that there is something in it. Did you know the oldest university on the planet Earth, they say it's in Africa? And this is the one I was telling you, they say it's about universe. So this is concluded right there at 5 o'clock. This is not a debate but a conversation and a search for knowledge on how different cultures on the continent of Africa frame their research concerns outside the Western mode of knowledge production. What steps do these cultures take to codify and disseminate their theories and perspectives to others and within themselves? I have explained the Yoruba healing system to you, and that's what I have there. So apart from this way of contacting diseases, there are other ways. The list above I showed you represents ways in which a person can become unwell. And these pathways explain how the sick move from healing process and finally to health. In other words, there are physical and metaphysical illnesses. That is, illnesses you can see and treat with herbs, and illnesses of the spirit which are treated by diviners. Thank you very much.
So we're not gonna take any questions, but you're here. Please have some cheese and some plantain chips, and if you